Johnny Carson turned to his producer and said, "Is this guy actually going to show up?" The producer shrugged. Marlon Brando, Hollywood's most unpredictable man, had agreed to appear on The Tonight Show. Carson knew what that meant. 2 weeks earlier, Brando had turned the Oscar stage into a protest site. America was split in half. And now this man was about to sit across from Carson, live on air. Carson had his questions ready. Hollywood, The Godfather, the Oscar refusal. Brando had something else entirely on his mind. That night, Carson would realize the man sitting across from him had nothing in common with the portrait Hollywood had been painting for years. The man across from him had been trying to say something for a long time and no one had listened. That night, he had decided to finally speak. To understand this story, you have to go much further back than 1973. Marlon Brando's distance from Hollywood began the day Hollywood discovered him. When A Streetcar Named Desire hit theaters in 1951, America didn't see an actor. It saw a phenomenon. Torn t-shirt, muscular arms, sweat beading on the jaw. The studios packaged Brando as a sex symbol. Fan magazines declared him Hollywood's new wild child. Young women screamed in movie theaters. Studio executives were pleased. They had a marketable image on their hands, and they intended to use it to the fullest. Brando was uncomfortable with this image. He once told a studio executive, "I'm not a piece of meat." The executive laughed. "No, Marlon, you're a gold-plated piece of meat." Brando walked out and slammed the door. And the next day, even that became a headline. Brando loses control again. From his very first year, the dynamic was set no matter what Brando did. Hollywood would fit him into its own narrative. As the years passed, the labels multiplied. Rebel, difficult, genius, but impossible. Brando responded in his own way, by giving deliberately absurd answers in interviews. When a journalist asked, "What does acting mean to you?" Brando stared at a spot on the ceiling for several minutes and then said, "Nothing." The journalist wrote it up as Brando doesn't care about acting. What Brando likely meant was something different. The absurdity of cramming acting into a definition, into a box. In another interview, a journalist kept pushing about his personal life. Brando took the man's pen, drew a circle on his own palm, and said, "There, all your answers are right here." The journalist stared at his palm, an empty circle. The next day's headline, Brando insults reporter. Brando's irony operated in a language the media couldn't read, and every time it backfired on him. One of the few people who knew what Brando was like behind the camera was his close friend and producer George England. Years later, in an interview, he described it this way: "Everyone thought Marlon was angry. He wasn't. He was worn out from people not listening to him, just watching him." During those years, Brando was marching alongside Martin Luther King Jr. in the civil rights movement. He was there at the 1963 March on Washington. He was visiting Native American reservations. He was speaking openly against racial discrimination, at a time when doing so carried real career risk. The press consistently treated these activities as footnotes. The headlines always followed the same pattern: Brando causes trouble again, as if it were impossible for someone to be both a good actor and a thinking human being. By the late 1960s, his career was in decline. After the box office failure of Mutiny on the Bounty, studios closed their doors. Film offers dried up, and the ones that remained were mediocre projects. Critics began writing farewell pieces. Where has Brando's genius gone? Brando didn't respond. He bought an island in Tahiti, Titiaroa, and withdrew from Hollywood. Among the palm trees, thousands of miles from the studios, he built a quiet life. Most people assumed the story was over. In 1972, Francis Ford Coppola called. He was offering the role of Vito Corleone in The Godfather. Paramount was reluctant. They knew the risks of working with Brando, the insurance costs, the on-set discipline issues. Coppola insisted. Brando did a screen test at home by himself. He stuffed cotton in his cheeks, slicked his hair back, dropped his shoulders. That few minutes of tape changed the Paramount executives' minds. One of them, watching the footage, asked, "Who is this guy?" Coppola smiled. "That's Marlon Brando." When The Godfather hit theaters, critics used the same word, genius. The hushed voice, the slow movements, the stroking of the cat, the tension in the jaw, every detail was Brando's own choice, not the director's or the studio's. Hollywood celebrated the comeback with excitement. "Brando is reborn," the headlines proclaimed. Brando, however, was somewhere else, because during the same period, another film was being made that would affect him deeply, Last Tango in Paris. Director Bernardo Bertolucci asked Brando for something no director had ever demanded before, to open himself up completely. He didn't give Brando a full script. He didn't detail the scenes in advance. While the camera rolled, he steered Brando toward his own past, his own pain. "Give me Marlon," he would say. "I don't want a character. I want you." Brando did it. In front of the camera, he talked about his childhood, the cold winter nights in Omaha, his alcoholic father shouting, finding his mother drunk in bar corners, the years of feeling unloved. These weren't lines. This was Brando's real life. And Bertolucci never stopped the camera. When the film was completed, Brando said in an interview, "Bernardo used me. He took my emotions and pasted them onto the screen. After that, he never watched the film again, for the rest of his life." Years later, Bertolucci admitted that in certain scenes he had deliberately caught Brando and his co-star Maria Schneider off guard. Schneider described what she experienced as a real violation and said she struggled with it for years. Brando's reaction was less visible. He made no public statement. He didn't express his anger outwardly. In words reportedly spoken to a friend, "I will never again let a director strip my soul." Last Tango became a turning point in Brando's relationship with his profession. Whatever trust he still had in acting eroded there. And a few months later, the Oscars came, March 1973. When his Best Actor nomination for The Godfather was confirmed, Brando had already made his decision. He wouldn't attend the ceremony. And he wouldn't just not show up. He wanted to send a message. He believed Hollywood did the same thing to Native American communities that it had done to him: caricature them, use them, then look the other way. Brando had met a young Apache Yaqui activist named Sacheen Littlefeather. He prepared a speech for her to deliver on Oscar night and asked her to take the stage. Sacheen hesitated. "I don't know what's going to happen." Brando's answer was short: "Neither do I. It's the right thing to do." March 27, 1973. Dorothy Chandler Pavilion. Every corner of the hall was filled with Hollywood's most recognizable names: directors, producers, stars. When Roger Moore and Liv Ullmann opened the envelope, the audience already knew: Marlon Brando. Applause began. It wasn't Brando who walked onto the stage. A young woman in Apache dress approached the microphone. Sacheen Littlefeather announced that Brando was refusing the award, protesting the film industry's treatment of Native American communities. The reaction from the audience was mixed. Some applauded, some booed. Shouts of "Get off the stage" were heard. John Wayne tried to intervene from backstage. Security stopped him. When Clint Eastwood took the stage a few moments later, he quipped, "I hope I don't need a Cherokee to win this." Sacheen, meanwhile, was backstage trying to compose herself. Brando was at his home on Mulholland Drive. He turned on the television, watched Sacheen, heard the boos. A friend who was with him that night described Brando's reaction. He wasn't angry. He wasn't sad. It was as if something he'd been waiting for a long time had finally happened, but the happening hadn't brought him any relief. The next day, the country split in two. One side praised Brando for his courage. The other accused him of betrayal. Newspapers ran the usual headlines. It was debated on television programs, discussed on radio shows. The argument kept circling the same point: what Brando had done. Very few asked why he had done it. This is where Carson entered the picture. The Tonight Show producer reached out to Brando's manager. The offer was straightforward. Brando comes on, tells his side of the Oscar story in his own words. America was curious. Carson wanted to bring that curiosity to live television. The manager hesitated. There was no predicting what Brando might say on live TV. Brando, surprisingly, accepted. The reason was probably simple. For years, everyone had been speaking on his behalf. Journalists, critics, studio executives, they were all certain they knew what Brando was thinking. Maybe, in front of Carson, on live television he could speak in his own words for once. Uncut, unedited. Carson, meanwhile, was preparing. On his desk sat a thick file on Brando. Career notes, the Oscar incident, press clippings, old interview transcripts. His producer had delivered a final warning. Be careful, Johnny. This guy can derail everything. Carson closed the file. He was ready. The Tonight Show studio had an unusual energy that evening. As the audience took their seats, the whispers didn't stop. Everyone knew who the guest was that night. Carson did his opening monologue, rattled off a few jokes. The audience laughed. Carson's eyes drifted toward the wings from time to time. Backstage, Brando was sitting in a chair. He had refused makeup. He wore a plain jacket. No special preparation. No special costume. A production assistant brought him water. Brando thanked him and left the glass untouched. The assistant described that moment years later. He didn't look excited, didn't look nervous. He was weighing something inside himself. Carson turned to the audience. Tonight's guest, do I even need to introduce him? The man everyone's been talking about for the past few weeks. The Godfather's father. The unwanted owner of an Oscar. A brief pause. Marlon Brando. Brando walked out, unhurried, at his own pace. The audience applauded. There was a polite expression on Brando's face, but he wasn't smiling. He sat down in the chair next to Carson. Carson extended his hand. A brief handshake. The first question was a standard opener. Marlon, it's wonderful to see you here. How are you? Brando thought for a moment. Are you actually curious how I am? Or are you asking the question the show requires you to ask? The audience laughed. Carson laughed too, but a beat late. There was no joke in Brando's tone. From the very first minute, it was clear the conversation wasn't going to follow the usual talk show format. Carson recovered. All right then, I'm genuinely asking, how are you, Marlon? I'm tired, Johnny. Have been for a long time. Carson moved to the Oscar issue. The question the audience was waiting for. Why didn't you go? Why didn't you accept the award? Carson asked it in a tone that was neither aggressive nor fawning, just curious. Brando didn't answer right away. A few seconds of silence. On live television, a few seconds of dead air feels long. The audience shifted in their seats. Carson waited. Most hosts would have tried to fill that silence. Carson didn't. That was his craft. When Brando began to speak, his voice was low. Johnny, I didn't reject the award. I rejected what the award represents. Carson asked, what does it represent? Brando leaned forward slightly. An industry. This industry takes people, creates an image out of them, then sells that image. It did the same thing to Native Americans, turned them into caricatures, killed them off in cowboy movies, then locked the real ones away on reservations. Carson tried to lighten the air. Now, Marlon, some people say you did this just for the attention. Brando cut him off. Not harsh, but firm. If I wanted attention, I would have walked onto the Oscar stage myself. The whole point of not being there was that I didn't speak. Sacheen spoke. Her voice was more important than mine. The balance of the conversation shifted here. This was no longer a discussion. Carson was steering. Brando was deciding where it would go. Carson tried a different angle. What about acting? The Godfather was an extraordinary performance. Do you still love it? A brief change crossed Brando's face. Momentary, almost imperceptible. Acting is surviving, Johnny. I never loved acting. Acting kept me alive. There's a difference. Carson didn't know what to say. In 30 years of his career, he had sat with thousands of guests, but the man across from him was speaking outside the format. Brando continued. He talked about Hollywood being a machine, about how it takes people and turns them into images. They made a rebel out of me, he said. Because rebels sell. I'm not a rebel, Johnny. I'm just a man who asks questions. And this industry calls people who ask questions difficult. Then, without naming it directly, he touched on Last Tango. He didn't use the film's title, but everyone understood. When a director asks you to open your soul, and you do it, and then that soul is sold as a product, something breaks down. You can't fix it. His voice had grown quieter. Carson stayed silent. The audience did too. The only sound left in the studio was the faint hum of the air conditioning unit. Brando straightened up. I didn't come here to talk about the Oscar, Johnny. This industry, this beautiful, shiny industry, consumes people. It consumed me. It will keep consuming. At least I got to say this. On live television. Uncut. Carson looked at him for a while. Then he simply said, "Thank you, Marlon." Quiet. Sincere. Brando nodded. Brando's Oscar refusal was interpreted for years as a political stunt. The Native American rights issue was real. Brando cared deeply about it, but those close to him painted a more complex picture years later. Brando's relationship with his profession, with Hollywood, and even with his own public identity had been unraveling during that period. Last Tango had affected him deeply. The Godfather's success hadn't restored the balance. On the contrary, Hollywood's Brando is back. Enthusiasm had only accelerated the withdrawal growing inside him. The Oscar refusal wasn't merely a protest. Brando, whether consciously or not, was telling Hollywood, "I'm done playing your game." Rejecting the award was, in truth, rejecting the role Hollywood had assigned him. And when he sat across from Carson, he had articulated this openly for the first time. I never loved acting. Acting kept me alive. That sentence makes it possible to look at Brando's career from a different angle. Stanley Kowalski, Vito Corleone, Paul in Last Tango. These were perhaps not merely performances but ways of getting away from that cold house in Omaha, from the shadow of an alcoholic father. The stage was an exit point for Brando. Over time, that exit point became a burden of its own. Sacheen Littlefeather, shortly before her death in 2022, returned to that night in an interview. She shared for the first time what Brando had told her before Oscar night. Marlon said to me, "Sacheen, I'm tired. Your voice isn't tired. Go and let them hear your voice, not mine." Even in his own act of protest, Brando had put someone else forward instead of himself. Carson didn't figure Brando out that night. There probably wasn't anything to figure out. Brando wasn't a complicated puzzle. He was simply a man whose words weren't taken seriously. After The Tonight Show, the press showed its usual reflex. Some called it calculated provocation. Others said attention dependency. But a portion of the audience had noticed something different. The man sitting across from Carson wasn't putting on a show. He was trying to say something. Brando gradually distanced himself from Hollywood in the years that followed. He turned down most film offers. When he did accept the role of Jor-El in Superman, for instance, he spent minimal time on set and invested the money in his island in Tetiaroa. "We spend the money on the island," he said once. Hollywood eventually stopped trying to understand him and settled on a new label, the genius who gave up on himself. Brando didn't care about that one either. Sacheen Littlefeather's story took a more painful course. After Oscar night, Hollywood blacklisted her. Her acting career ended before it began. She received threatening letters. She was buried in silence for years. In 2022, shortly before her death, the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences issued a formal apology. 49 years later, when Sacheen accepted the apology, she was standing on a stage, just as she had in 1973. This time the audience was on its feet. applauding. Sacheen smiled. A calm, peaceful smile. 3 weeks later, she passed away. Brando died in 2004, at the age of 80. In his final years, he gave almost no interviews, but in audio notes he recorded late in life, it emerged that he had given a different answer to Carson's question, "Do you still love acting?" His voice on the tape was aged, hushed, but calm. "Maybe I did love it. Maybe admitting I loved it meant admitting how much it hurt me, and I wasn't ready for that." Brando was Hollywood's greatest actor. All he ever wanted his whole life was to be heard as a human being, not as an actor. The man who sat across from Carson that night had said exactly that, openly, on live television. Years passed, and people did the same thing they always had. They debated the performance and didn't hear the man. Maybe someone around you is going through exactly that today. Speaking, but not being heard. If this story made you feel something, share it and subscribe, because here we tell the moments that deserve not to be forgotten.